We're joined here live in the studio by author and political cartoonist Rall, who's made a lot of comics connected to the Ukrainian conflict and the West's stance towards Russia and its allies. Ted, thanks a lot for joining us in the studio. It's an honor to have you here. First thing I want to ask you about is the kind of, you might call, double standards in the Western media. I mean, we saw how the mainstream media immediately launched a massive campaign against Russia after it launched its military operation, when we didn't see the kind of same reaction when these same Western media, or when the West launched U.S.-led military interventions into countries like Yugoslavia, Iraq. We didn't see the same kind of reaction from these media outlets. So what do you make of that?
Well, I mean, it's all different when it's your country, doing the thing that you say other countries shouldn't be doing. Hypocrisy is rampant in international politics as well as domestic politics, and it's so extreme, though, in this particular case that. It's kind of depressing and transparent for anyone who's actually paying attention. The United States media was really actively complicit in the war against Afghanistan. And I would say even now, with the effect of the sanctions on Afghanistan that are pretty much being ignored or shrugged off, all the rhetoric is always brought back to, well, what are the Taliban doing? The United States is keeping Afghan government money. So, there's no comparison in the way that these two issues are framed or covered by the United States mainstream corporate media.
Well, I wanted to ask you about one of your cartoons. It's called If We Were on the Other Side of the Ukraine-Russia Crisis, showing how the U.S. would have reacted if missiles were aimed at them from a nearby country. And that exact same situation has actually happened before, back in the early 60s, obviously with the Soviet Union deploying missiles into Cuba. And the Americans didn't like that, did they? I mean, do you think they've forgotten historical lessons here? Well,
most Americans don't really remember historical lessons in the first place in order to forget them. So it's not really actively taught. And, historical context is just not presented in American news accounts. So nobody ever says, well, okay, so in 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, this happened, but this is a different scenario. First of all, it's not a different scenario. And it's impossible to imagine the United States tolerating, for example, Mexico or Canada becoming anything less than friendly to the United States in any way. If the Soviet Union were still around, would Canada be allowed to join the Warsaw Pact? Would they be allowed to talk about joining the Warsaw Pact? No.
Well, right. I also wanted to ask, I mean, of course, it's pretty clear how people would probably react if governments in Canada or Mexico became hostile to the United States. But how do you think people would react if an anti-American revolution happened in one of those countries and Americans began to become oppressed there?
Right. Well, I mean, that was the casus belli for the Reagan's invasion of Grenada, right, which is hilarious. It's a tiny little Caribbean island. They claimed that there was about 150 or so U.S. medical students who were oppressed by the new socialist government on that island. And Reagan ordered a full-fledged military invasion and takeover. And then the first thing that happened when the medical students arrived in the United States after being liberated was they were asking the reporters, what's going on? We were fine. So, yeah, no, we know exactly what the U.S. would do in such a situation.
Mm-hmm. Well, another thing we've heard from Washington, of course, is claiming that other nuclear powers might be aggressors. However, the U.S. is obviously the only country in the world that's actually used an atomic bomb or a nuclear weapon at all. And they used it twice, not just once, in Japan in 1945. What's your assessment of the U.S.'s position on this?
Well, the United States loves to project psychologically its own political stance. Well, what if, say, Iraq under Saddam Hussein were to give WMDs to a terrorist group? I mean, no one's ever done that. There's no record of that at all. We know that the United States may have allowed nuclear technology to be transferred to some of its allies, but they're the only people on record as having done anything like that. You see the same sort of thinking vis-a-vis China. Well, what if China were to become militarily aggressive, although they have no history of doing that in thousands of years? So, they don't invade their neighbors. There's been a few little border skirmishes. But the United States invades countries on the other side of the planet, like Vietnam or Iraq or Afghanistan. There's a proxy war in Yemen. The hypocrisy is amazing. And as an American, I'm born and raised there. I do not I just don't fathom how more people can't see it. I mean, many people do, but more should.
Well, I want to bring the conversation into the realm of sanctions. I really want to hear what you have to say about the fact that, of course, we've seen unprecedented Western sanctions against Russia since the military operation in Ukraine was launched. Do you think they're going to be successful? And can European Union countries survive without Russian energy sources?
Well, the sanctions seem to be very effective at hurting the Western economy and driving up inflation and energy prices in the United States and its Western allies. You know, I mean, Moscow, I've been here for 24 hours since I got here. It does not look like it's on its knees economically. The only, I'm inconvenienced because I have to pay for my hotel in cash. It's really annoying ordinary people. And, you know, these sanctions, all U.S. sanctions have a very poor record of success in other countries. I mean, look at Cuba. They've been trying to sanction the Castro regime out of existence since the late 1950s, still with no success whatsoever. So I think the only surprise about the sanctions failure is that it's really unraveling so quickly. I mean, here we are in the middle of the summer. You know, Eastern Europe not in dire need of heating oil. And what's going to happen when the winter comes? We were expecting this to really start to hit in November and December. We're already seeing the effects. President Biden's already having to try to talk down the possibility of an imminent recession, or maybe the possibility that the U.S. economy has already entered recession. So, you know, the effects are there. I think, you know, Russia saw what was coming and was prepared.
Yeah, and on top of these sanctions, the backlash from that, there's, of course, the expense of helping Ukraine in the conflict that's come from the United States and the European Union. And yet Ukraine's president criticizes the European bloc for a lack of efforts. They've even made a blacklist of so-called Russian propagandists, including high American officials and EU politicians. Do you think they're going too far here? I mean, what do you make of that kind of behavior?
Well, I mean, I guess in the Ukrainians' defense, they're just trying to win, and they'll say and do anything to do so. But, you know, as an American, I think of $60 billion that are going to waste on a project that is going to be unsuccessful no matter where you stand on this issue. I mean, you know, Ukraine's not going to win. And so at this point, I live in New York City. I walk out of my door. I go into a streets filled with homeless people, filled with boarded up storefronts from businesses that went under during COVID because they didn't get any assistance. I ride subways that are filthy and unmaintained. You know, $60 billion would do a lot of good to the American people. I think, you know, you're starting to see even President Trump mention that on the campaign trail. It's kind of an echo of how he criticized the Iraq and Afghanistan invasions in his 2016 race. So it's pretty, you know, I think it's really interesting to see the two parties sort of switch positions, where the Democrats have become the war party, the Republicans are becoming more nationalistic and looking more to domestic needs.
Yeah, I definitely think that's interesting as well. And as you mentioned Donald Trump. I wanted to ask you about the fact that he said that the Democrats have led the U.S. into a crisis. How bad do you think that people in the U.S. are feeling right now as a result of Democratic policies?
Well, the Democrats have created a crisis. I mean, I think Biden did a few things well early on in his presidency, namely the economic stimulus and also focusing on COVID-19 relief. But things started to fall apart pretty quickly. The Ukraine conflict, it was a huge distraction, you know, backing a government and a cause that most Americans don't really know anything about and are not really being told the whole truth about. The inflationary effects of the stimulus were kind of underestimated. And now you have a situation where the prices are getting so out of control that now the Federal Reserve Bank is slamming the brakes on the economy. And that, ironically, is kind of too much too late. So, you know, it may be that it's just pent-up demand from 2 years of lockdown, and they should just sit tight and not increase interest rates. So you know, it's kind of like doing the wrong thing, doing the right thing at the wrong time all the time.
All right, well, author and political cartoonist Ted Rall, an honor having you here in the studio.
Thank you.